for those that you want to help with rent and or entry to purchase a home?
That's a great question. So for the rental portion of it, that's been, I don't want to say easy, because we have some of those things are in place already. Like, for example, we have a duplex that we're working on right now, and I've had several people with connections from Catholic Charities that say, hey, I have people who we can subsidize, we can pay first and the security deposit, or, you know, I even had them say we can even pay a couple of months of their rent. Okay, if we were concerned about them paying, but they still go through the screening process. But that's one way that is shown that it's helped. Same thing with housing. And another way has been through SNAP, getting some of those funds and getting things paid for. I have a tenant of mine right now who got into some hard times, and they got through with SNAP, and SNAP has been able to subsidize some of that for them. Other things, we're starting to get creative. I've met with Habitat for Humanity, and we've said let's work together and figure out a way where we can help some people. There's some things that they don't quite have in place yet, but again, that goes back to let's just figure this thing out. So it's still, that part is still a work in process, as far as we haven't had an example of how we're going to do the lease to own. Just honestly, we haven't put that out there and put it into practice, but we know the rental aspect of it. But we're working together to make sure that that's something that we can grow moving forward. And we have it in place. We just haven't had the person to execute it as far as the lease to own option of it. But as far as renters go, we have had people who have stepped up and helped, and even private citizens who've come to me and said, hey, I want to be able to help. Here's what we can do. And I said, wow, that's amazing. You're going to put forth this? Well, then more action from me then. I need to even do more now that we have this. So now let's start executing it again. So it's just consistent, continuous conversations that are leading to action plans. And we have a few more of those that we're starting to attack at the beginning of the year as well, where you have some people who have said, hey, I will subsidize that person's rent if we can get them in there and use this as a model.
That's awesome, because there are definitely investment clubs that focus on how to maximize returns on their investment without any regard for what that impact may be on the greater community. I mean, we know about the marketization of housing, and yet we shouldn't have honor rolls of those who have died on the streets of our city and in our region because of homelessness. That's unacceptable, and that should not be something that we are comfortable with or accept as normal at all. And so, you know, we need people coming together to be creative and work outside of the box, but also change the framing and the margins of that box so that some of these other things can be put into place to mitigate restrictions on creating more affordable housing. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to, I mean, I know Jim Frank has offered some of his thoughts and some links that are in the chat column that you can access. And I'd like to hear, you know, from Jim and Ben, and then we'll talk more specifically too about some of the tenant landlord issues, because Steve Corker's been very amenable to having discussions and sharing his perspective as well. So Jim, go ahead and share some of your thoughts.
Well, thanks, Marilyn, for inviting me, and good morning, everyone. I've been in the housing business for 40 years. And so I've seen a lot of things, and I've seen a lot of market conditions, and I've seen the market evolve over that time. And the housing crisis that we have today didn't start yesterday or didn't start last month. It's been a slow walk for probably 50 years. And we have systematically over that period done a couple of things. First of all, we've made it very difficult to build new houses. and a lot of that has come out of out of the thought that we have to restrict housing in ways that protect existing neighborhoods. So that led to zoning restrictions, for example, that created exclusive single-family neighborhoods. It created exclusive multifamily neighborhoods. It created exclusive commercial districts. And so we forgot how to mix uses. We forgot how to create integrated neighborhoods. And it's happened over a very long period of time. I grew up in Spokane, and I grew up in the Garfield neighborhood, went to Garfield Elementary. And in my neighborhood when I grew up, there were small little apartment buildings, there were small condominium buildings, there were neighborhood grocery stores. My neighborhood was walkable. My neighborhood was very stable. I still have lunch with kids I went to elementary school with. And we meet once a week. And so there's a social connectedness that comes from integrating housing. A lot of that has been lost. And the other thing that's happened is that we have systematically created inequality and segregation in our housing within residential districts. So for example, we've taken neighborhoods like West Central and East Central, and in the city 20 or 30 years ago, zoned major portions of those districts multifamily. So if you go into West Central today, maybe half of West Central, where there's single family houses, they're just single family houses there. There was very little vacant land to be developed. And they zoned all of those massive tracts of single family houses, they zoned to multifamily. Well, what happens when you do that is that you create an incentive for the owner of the property to take it out of single family use and to put it into multifamily use. So it really started the cycle of disinvestment in West Central. And people would take a single family house and start renting out bedrooms. And so what happened in that neighborhood is that there's social consequences to that. In most of our neighborhoods, if you go to Comstock, for example, or the South Hill, you'll see that maybe 30% of the housing is multifamily and 70% is home ownership. You go into West Central and those numbers are reversed. 70% is rental and 30% is home ownership. So then that carries over into the elementary schools. And you now have elementary schools that have enormous transitions taking place in the children within the school. So you have children that enter in September, and by the time you get to June, half of them are gone. Half of them have been changed. And so when you do that, when you allow that to happen, then you steal from children the opportunity to have a stable environment in which they're growing. And so there's been a lot of research been done on the effect of housing on the opportunity for children. And they've mapped this actually. They've created what they call neighborhoods of opportunity. And then they rate neighborhoods based on the opportunity that's available in that neighborhood. And then they've looked at the outcomes on health, on education, on well-being in those neighborhoods. And what they found is that if you grow up in a neighborhood with high opportunity, your chances of success in life, your life expectancy, your health all improve. But we've gotten to the point that we take poor people and we put them in poor neighborhoods. And instead of allowing, so for example, the city of Spokane simply doesn't allow small homes and townhomes to be built in their single family neighborhoods on the South Hill, for example. And then they zone West Central and East Central so they can build small houses and rentals in those neighborhoods. And so that what you've done is you've hoarded opportunity. You've allowed neighborhoods on the South Hill to hoard opportunities. And then you've deprived other neighborhoods of those opportunities. This has been structurally built in to the regulatory framework of housing over the last 50 years. And this isn't the result of builders. Because I hear this a lot. Oh, well, builders just want to build expensive houses. That's not the truth. The truth is that builders build what you allow them to build. And when you tell builders, as the city told me, for example, when we were developing our project on the South Hill, the Garden District on 29th and Perry, they told us we couldn't build small houses. We had to build big houses. And they have regulatory requirements that tell you you have to build big houses. And so we were forced to do something we didn't want to do. So this can change, but it's going to take a massive effort on the part of to overcome the enormous bureaucracy that exists in government to more integrated housing. And it's not just at the city of Spokane level, it's also at the state level. I mean, the state funds most of our affordable housing through the federal low-income housing tax credit or money through the state housing trust fund. And both of those programs have locational requirements that require those projects to be located in low-income neighborhoods. That's what they do. And all of that has to change. I'm almost to the point where I believe that someone needs to bring legal action against the city under the Fair Housing Act, because it may be the only thing that gets this change occurring.
And Jim, thank you for sharing that, because I think the whole grasping the concept and the realization that these have been built in over a long period of time and continue to perpetuate until we interrupt those frameworks that have been put into place systematically, creating these pockets of opportunity neighborhoods versus low income neighborhoods. And I'm really thankful you brought up families with children, because there's lots of data that shows the impact of chronic poverty, chronic stress due to childhood adverse experiences, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Poverty is a huge one. I just thought during this COVID time, the high anxiety that those who have been directly affected by closure of the hospitality industries, the food restaurants and stuff. These are our lowest income service workers in those industries. And the fact that landlords and tenants have not received adequate or even a pittance of some of the COVID dollars to help with rent assistance is something that is just really remiss. And so Steve Corker, if you can talk about what you're aware of with your membership, because I know you represent, when you've said mostly mom and pop landlords, and what are you seeing and hearing on your end? And I know you've tried to work with others about getting rent assistance. Steve? Is Steve with us? Okay, Ben, go ahead.
Well, the COVID relief bill that Trump did sign in after 5 days of not signing it does include $25 billion in rent assistance. And that's going to be $500 million for the state of Washington, which should work out to around 25 to $30 million in rental assistance coming. I know there are some other uses for that dollar, but it is the title of that portion of the bill is rental assistance. Because as long as there is a moratorium, which is 100% morally and the right thing to have is an eviction moratorium during COVID. But as long as that happens, rents are not being paid. That affects the small landlords disproportionately, but it also affects the low-income housing providers in our community. We have one of our largest low-income housing providers is at risk right now of completely going under because of unpaid rent and not enough rental assistance. I completely agree with all of what Chauncey said about home ownership and his analysis of the situation. I agree with Jim 100% on the zoning. If you take the redlining maps from 100 years ago in Spokane, where BIPOC members of our community were not able to live, and then overlay those with our single family zones right now, they exactly match out. We've used, say there's a reason that single family zoning is called exclusionary zoning, because it still excludes people from those zones. And one of the things Jim mentioned is that we took the poorer neighborhoods towards the center and made those where our density is. But that density, according to our comprehensive plan, which passed because of the Growth Management Act 20 years ago, says very specifically, and the Growth Management Act says we can't spread out. It says we do have to create density and infill in our communities if we're not going to spread out and sprawl. But what it left it to was to cities, which are at the whim of the individuals closest to the citizens, which in our town, we have very strong neighborhood councils, and they want their neighborhoods to stay exactly the same. And that's who our city council members listen to. Just see what happened on Mission when they opened the shelter up there, and all the communication the mayor's office has been getting, which has made them gun shy about any more shelters in neighborhoods. So it's public pushback and NIMBYism, not in my backyard, that's really stopping us. When we should have density throughout the city, there's two things with zoning. We said we wanted centers and corridors as our growth management and comprehensive plan strategy, yet a majority of our centers and corridors are surrounded with single family homes. And if we want those centers and corridors to actually have successful business districts, you would surround them either 2 blocks or a quarter mile out with density, so that one, it's spread throughout the city and not just the density is spread throughout the city, but it's spread where it should be, because there are places that density actually makes sense. Just taking whole neighborhoods and making them dense, though, does create the problems. So you should take Monroe, where we just spent $10 million in investment. You've had 20 new businesses open. Those businesses will be closed in 10 years, those new businesses, if we don't create the people to walk and shop in those places. So it's good for business, people, eyes on the street near those business districts if you have the density. But we've located it all wrong. We haven't implemented any of the changes that the Growth Management Act actually says we should. So that's a problem. And then we need to really look at our single family zoning and what's allowed in that. And Jim put together a suite of changes that have been endorsed by the Low Income Housing Consortium, endorsed by the West Central group that he's been working with, the Real Estate Association. And these ideas have been floating around for years, but Jim put pen to paper a year and a half ago. Everybody that understands and studies housing knows that those changes to how we regulate ADUs, how we do setbacks, how we do transitional lots. You shouldn't have to have the same size lot next to another lot. That makes absolutely no sense and forces you to have large suburban style houses in areas that could be urban. And so we want those housing variety. Like if you walk through what's a successful neighborhood in Spokane is Kendall Yards. And Jim was only able to build Kendall Yards because it was a planned unit development, which is a specific area of the code. You cannot build those housing types and that housing variety in the single family neighborhoods all throughout Spokane. So we are stopping progress all over the place. Everybody agrees what those changes are. It's just going to take will on the part, and Paul, this is not picking on you because that will was not there for 8 years when I was there, but it's going to take will to change the single family zoning to allow more variety. And it's going to take areas that are single family that should be multifamily and changing that zoning. And it's going to, and there's a hard step there with the neighborhoods. But if we don't do that, we're going to continue to see the maps. We're going to continue to have a higher percentage of communities of color renting than owning. We're going to have a higher percentage of people in poverty that are in equity. We absolutely must do those. And I know Steve's on here, but my favorite change politician on housing is Jacob Ray, who's the mayor of Minneapolis. And he says, we can talk about the zoning and the regulatory framework, but it's housing is a stool where you also have to take care of those at the bottom. The bottom 15 to 20% require subsidized housing. And that's, I commend the city of Spokane for implementing 1590, because one, it'll put more subsidy into housing because federal and state subsidy have decreased over the last 30 years. But it also is flexible. The $1590 will be flexible, and that'll start next year with $6 million. And that flexibility will allow the city to invest in home ownership, deposits, co-ops, shared equity, other things that move us towards low-income housing, not just being apartment buildings, but moving people into home ownership so that we can build that. And then the third leg of that stool, though, that everybody talks about and we don't, it becomes controversial, is tenant protections. And whether you're reading about gentrification and displacement, every theorist in housing says that one of the ways to stop displacement and gentrification in neighborhoods you're improving is tenant protections to help them stay in their homes. Most communities have a relocation fund, which means if a developer comes in and buys an apartment building and wants to tear it down and build new apartments, or say they come in and buy a rental house and want to build maybe duplexes or triplexes, there's a fund that's funded by both the municipality and by the landlord to help them relocate to a new place. There are also rental registry units, but the biggest one is no cause evictions. If you can evict somebody for any reason, and you don't have to put a cause, you will always not put a cause. It makes it so hard for people discriminated against in our community to stay in stable housing. I was talking to one gentleman last week that in the last 5 years, he's lived in 36 different places. 30 of those evictions were no cause given at all. And all we're saying is that you have to give a cause, and all of those ordinances are very reasonable. But and then that's why rental assistance is part of protections for tenants. But you have to remember that we can change all the zoning we want, we can subsidize all the housing we want, but we also have to keep people in their apartments. And that's what gets missed sometimes when we're talking about housing. We need all of them to work together, and that's when we get actual change.
Well, thank you, Ben. You covered a lot there, and unfortunately, Steve Corker lost his connection. I sent it via email to him. Sherri, I don't know if you can send it to him, through your cell phone or not, but at any rate, more thoughts from Jim, Chauncey, anyone else here? I know there are others here that no doubt have some thoughts they'd want to share about.
Steve Corker just came back in.
Okay, super. Okay, well, Steve, let's see. Okay.
He's working on it.
Well, he's working on it. Okay. So Sherri, did you want to share anything from your perspective until Steve gets on?
Well, I just agree with everything that everybody has said. And it's when you throw in the income issues and you throw in, minority and people of color and disabled single parents, then, it just adds to that, especially if without that just cause or specific cause, whatever you want to call it, that puts such a stress as a single mom with 4 kids on a Section 8 voucher. When I went month to month with my landlord, who was a jerk, that stress level of, do I call him about this repair, or is he going to get mad enough that he's just going to give me a 30-day? You know, I mean, it just, even though I have just cause protection sort of from Section 8, it still was at the back of my head, you know, am I going to have to find a place? And so that's really important. And then, yeah, we need to be educating the neighborhood councils about the importance of mixing and providing others with that opportunity. Because if we don't, it's not going to be good for the future.
So Steve, we're glad to have you back on. And I just want to say that early on in starting to dive into affordable housing, Airway Heights was a model in the sense that they have a code compliance officer that they've hired through the city. And she primarily provides tenant education outreach and has formed connections with those landlords and property owners who rent to some of their more, I would say, high call, frequent call for attention. And Airway Heights has something like 60% of its residents are renters. So it's been a really good model too, because the regional health district has had some outreach focused on the Airway Heights, and just that some of the habitability issues are just huge. So it's occurred to us that including single family rental properties in those code compliance regulations, and having a registry so that you know who the property owners actually are. You know, some tenants don't have the wherewithal to be able to go through tax records to try and find out who, you know, who the actual property owner is. There are different levels like management companies in between. And, you know, when you're really struggling, you may not be able to, you know, put in that kind of concerted effort trying to find out, you know, who actually owns the property. So Steve, I know has had some agreement, you know, in our conversations and with Chauncey to brought up the landlord registry. So Steve, now that you're back with us, what are some of your thoughts about a landlord registry and just cause eviction or specific cause eviction?
I've never been opposed to a landlord registry. What I've been opposed to is using that registry as a funding mechanism to increase fees that are eventually passed on to the tenants. About 3 years ago, when I was working with a city committee, we realized that we didn't know how many rental properties existed. And in cooperation with Avista, with the county, and with city utilities, we identified the 42,000 rental units in the city of Spokane. And we had a great opportunity, and one I've been screaming for the last 3 years, to take that data and put it into a registry to identify, not only identify the property owners, but identify the property managers, so that there was a responsible link to the property managers first. And then obviously if grievances were moved to a second level, would move then to the property owners themselves. And I don't know why the city in this particular case has not taken advantage of that data and put it in. The same argument has to do with inspections. I've never had really strong opposition from my membership, the 800 members that are in the 11 counties in Eastern Washington, especially those who participate in Section 8. The objection always been is the fee structure associated with those inspections that are used, again, to finance other particular issues. But being able to identify that resource is critical in all our planning, and that the city or the state, at the county, or at the federal level. So gathering that data has never been a strong objection by the vast majority of landlords.
Great, great. Okay, so Mr. Warfield, I'd like to invite you to share with us what your thoughts are about further developing and taking that data that already exists and then updating it and having that something that the city of Spokane might be inclined to utilize.
Thank you, Marilyn. Good morning, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Paul Warfield and I work at the city of Spokane. I do know a number of you already. Thank you for the shout out, Ben. And I agree with you that I think, I agree with you on almost everything, that we know generally the options that are on the table. There have been numerous blue ribbon commissions. There have been studies, people like Jim, your excellent work putting your ideas to paper. All these ideas are out there. It's a matter of prioritizing those policy and practice recommendations, identifying where there is a will to get those things done, to your point, Ben, and moving those forward. COVID has created a bit of a capacity constraint within the city between the staff that is generally focused on these housing issues are also deeply involved and engaged in things like ensuring our shelter system has remained available and steady, expanding to that Mission Avenue facility, and continuing to manage the economic effects. So the city has been, I would say, staff-wise, a little bit stretched. And so we're not an excuse, it's just a reason. And so we're looking at ways to keep this prioritized and top of mind. So I'm excited to be here to listen today to this group. Thank you, Marilyn, for putting it together. I'm glad to see all these different stakeholder groups, all these different advocates come together for these conversations, because it's always heartening to hear from members in the community that know, which is each and every one of you, what needs to be done and how we can get there. And I'll look for each of your support as we continue to have these conversations and educate those that are a little more reticent to make the changes that are necessary in the community.
Well, thank you, Paul, because I know several people were concerned that this would be, a great conversation and, have different folks together at the table and we'd talk about it. But one of the points that has come across to me from numerous people is, we want to be able to commit to some plans of action and to be able to actually get some ways of moving forward to address these, because it's true. COVID, this is a once in a lifetime experience. Hopefully, knock on wood, we don't experience another iteration 3 years down the road or 5 years down the road. But what it has done in a positive way, the silver lining is now we know, it's unmistakable. The data is out there. It's very clear that we have huge gaps in our structural systems and the very basic human right to have a home and from which to go forth into the world and do what you want to do, need to do. That's just fundamental. And so I really believe that we can grasp this opportunity now to make things much more improved moving forward and to get some of those disconnects between comprehensive plans and the upcoming updates for the Growth Management Act, get those so that there's congruency and not these big disconnects. So Ms. Wendell, you're representing Spokane County, and this is not just a city of Spokane issue. This is Eastern Washington, this is statewide, it's on a national level. So I'd love to hear from you some of your thoughts and perspectives about what we've talked about so far and what the county may be looking at in terms of getting on board with some of these needs.
Oh, well, thank you, Marilyn. Hi, everybody. Just to clarify, I should have put it on my thing. I am contracting with the county, so I am not here in a representative with the commissioners by any stretch of the imagination. I'm actually at the fairgrounds doing the PPE distribution today. But really, I can more speak from a commercial real estate owner really here. And I did message Ben about our centers and corridors. I think that that's really important that we look at some of those zoning changes, because one thing that, you know, Ben and I were going back and forth about is when we look at who we're going to have in our centers and corridors for those that are renting space from us, the questions I get when I went to national conventions, a lot of our national retailers want to know about density, and they'll look at 1 mile radius density, and Spokane is severely behind. And that is something that as we look at how we're developing our entire community on not just a housing, but to serve everybody in all means, that's something we need to take a look at. And the other thing too is when we talk about neighborhood councils, just from experience, and you know, those of us that run for office and have worked with the neighborhood councils, I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying about education. Bringing people along board is very important. And I think a lot of people have I don't want to blame anybody for that, but I think it is important that we do some outreach to the neighborhood councils and bring them alongside. I'm on the board at Family Promise, and I'm so proud of Joe Ader for the work that they did trying to figure out a place where to put a family shelter, and how he was very proactive about working with the neighborhood to make sure that he answered questions. And Jim, you've done the same thing on the South Hill, and you turn it into more of a collaborative project versus just somebody trying to go in and do something. So I think that that's the avenue we should take as we approach our neighborhood councils and work with them. It's going to be a very important piece of this whole puzzle.
All right, thank you very much, Cindy. Appreciate your thoughts on that. Sherri, should we open up now to the question and answer, and that way folks that have been putting comments or questions can have a chance?
Yes, I think that would be a great idea. Just a reminder, you can either type the question in the chat and I will try and catch it, or you can go to the participants link, and on your name, you can click the blue hand, which will allow me to know that you're raising your hand to ask a question. And I will try it and do it in the order. This is the first time I've done this, so bear with me. And I guess we can start from there. So whoever might have questions, I'm gonna start with a couple that were in the chat. Barry asked, how do you convince the neighborhoods that have been hoarding opportunity to give up some of their opportunities? Anybody want to respond?
I agree with the education is the most important first step in involving them. Jim Frank did do a great job. The first meeting he had on the project on 29th and Southeast Boulevard area had probably 150 people that were ready to really tell Greenstone to go pound sand. And they kept coming back and educating, involving them. And now the neighborhood's really, most of the neighborhood is really excited. The people that live adjacent to the development still are not. I just had one of them come and talk to me the other day as I was walking by the field across is empty. Of course, he doesn't want it to change. But it also takes, I think, having conversations with politicians before they're elected about this issue. Because unless you get them on record before the election, then they'll just hem and haw and bow to the pressure. Because you're always going to have the loudest people are always going to be the ones that don't want change and want the status quo to stay the same. And we have to have drastic, it's not like just making one little change here to fix our housing problem. This is multiple steps that are going to be hard lifts. And so I found it, you have to get somebody on record that they'll support things like zoning changes, and they'll support looking at and moving forward with changing single family zones so you can have more housing variety. And they'll be open to those conversations. But if you don't get them on record beforehand, they'll just listen to the loudest voices, which are the ones that don't want change. So it's a bit about being organized before elections and really putting the pressure on them while they're running, I think, because it is ultimately up to them to make those decisions. And people keep kicking the can down the ball if they have the opportunity.
Yeah, very true. So Becky has a question for Jim. With the passing of 1590, the next hurdle seems to be zoning. I have heard your opinion on the zoning restrictions, and Betsy Wilkerson has said she was told it would take 5 years to overturn the current zoning laws. How can we move forward to amend the zoning restrictions?
Well, I think just to follow up on what Ben said, this is a big problem that took a long time for us to get into it, and it's going to take a long time to get out of it. So I think, first of all, the changes have to be incremental. I think we need to, this isn't something that we can just have a big study and then we come out with the results of the study and we do it and it's over. Not going to happen. This is little incremental changes that we have to make over 10 or 20 years that's going to change the system that we have. So you need to do today what you can. And I think too many people are thinking, let's just study this some more. Let's just get this big volume of information put together and then we'll do something. And the world doesn't happen that way. We need to do what we can today, and we need to continue to do it. The other thing is, we've created a system, and this is especially true in the city of Spokane, where we've created an environment where we believe we've allowed people to think they have a voice in something that they don't actually have a voice in. So in Liberty Lake, for example, small multifamily and townhouses are permitted outright in a zone. So when a builder wants to do that, they just go get a building permit and they do it. And there's no controversy over it because people understand what the rules are. The city of Spokane treats it differently. If you want to do something like a cottage ordinance, then they require you to have a public notice. When you give people public notice that a developer wants to do something, they believe that they have a say in it then. They believe that the developer is asking for some special permission. And that's actually not the case. But so we have to be careful about how we frame things. And the city has a ordinance that says all the lots adjacent to my lot have to be the same size as my lot. They call it a lot size transition rule. Well, when you put that rule in place, you're sending a message to people that if I allow a small lot next to me, it's going to be bad for me because the city actually put a rule in place that prevents it. So these ordinances in themselves send messages to people, and those messages create expectations. And so that has to change. You can't create expectations around things that are not true. There's no data anywhere in the world that building a townhouse next to a single family lot will depreciate the value of the single family lot. And all you have to do is look at Kendall Yards, where we've built townhouses and apartments across the street from $1 million houses. And it has no effect on value. So so much of this is built into the structure of the code. And when we find something simple, like the lot size transition rule, we should just get rid of it. It doesn't take a big study to get rid of it. You just need to incrementally, every week, every month, do what you can.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Cindy Wendell.
Jim, I wanted to ask you, you were talking about the mix of multifamily versus single family. Oh, but he just walked away. And Ben, I don't know if maybe this can be a discussion. What would be an ideal mix? We were talking about the 30-70 and then it flipped. Has anybody done any studies or want to see something that's different than what we have?
I don't know. In my ideal world, we'd just get rid of single family zoning and allow people to build what they build inside all the housing zones. You can still have commercial zones, but the developer knows what's going to sell or not. They're not building something that's not going to sell in a neighborhood. And we need to get over this, that I deserve my suburban style neighborhood. Parking requirements are pointless. Like, a developer is going to build a parking space or a garage if they think they need it to sell. We shouldn't require everybody to have a parking garage. We have such a problem. I don't know if I've ever read anything about what the correct mix of multifamily versus single family is. I think it just needs to move away from single family, which is historically a racist housing policy.
Jim, before you stepped away, I asked, and Ben was talking about doing away with some of our single family zoning and just doing a market type style of zoning, what would fit. But from your perspective, have you seen, you were talking about mixes of multifamily versus single family. What is your thought on what that percentage mix really should be?
Well, I think that, I think what we've done in multifamily zones is we've said there's only one type of housing you can build. That's a single family detached house. I believe what you should say is that you should set massing standards. For example, you can't go higher than 35 feet. And then you have density standards, like in the city of Spokane, 10 units an acre. In Spokane County, it's 6 units an acre. You should regulate housing by density and by building mass or building height. And then you should allow any type of housing unit to be built as long as it's within that mass and scale and as long as it's within that density requirement of that zone. So you can have lower density zones, but you allow a wide range of product to occur within those zones. I think at the end of the day, the market can define how much of that ends up being in home ownership and how much of it ends up being rental. But right now, the market is not free to make that decision because the city zones property for multifamily or they zone it for single family detached. And so if they were to zone a lot of property multifamily and that's the only thing you can build, then you'd find a lot of multifamily being constructed. And that's what happened in West Central. What happened in West Central happened because of city zoning regulations. It didn't happen because of the market. And by the way, Spokane County is on the verge of adopting a zoning ordinance that's going to allow duplexes and triplexes and up to fourplexes to be built in their single family zone subject to their density. So that's a direction that I believe we should be going. We should be regulating housing by massing and scale and not limiting in single family zones only to single family detached houses. You should be able to build townhouses. You should be able to build small condos or small apartments within that zone as long as you meet the density of that zone.
Thank you so much. Craig Howard had a comment following Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Sherri. Craig with Family Promise of Spokane here, just stepping in for Joe Ader, my boss, who had a previous engagement. But, you know, just to piggyback on what Jim was saying before, our open door shelter in the Chief Gary neighborhood, I think offers a great microcosm of overcoming that stigma of multifamily or density. You know, a lot of pushback over 2 years ago when that open door shelter was being planned. And I think Joe told me that he had about 20 community meetings with folks, helping them to overcome their fears or, you know, just these misplaced stereotypes about what it was going to be. And if you talk to neighbors in that area now, I mean, Open Doors has become an asset to that community. You've got kids playing, you've got, you know, just the sounds of families in that neighborhood. Same with our Hartson House in the Perry District. You know, folks have embraced those projects. And I will just say that, you know, the lack of affordable housing is really creating this bottleneck with nonprofits like Family Promise, UGM, Salvation Army. We served almost 1,200 people last year, 386 families. It'll be about half that amount in 2020, simply because they have nowhere to go. You know, they are just in a stall mode, in a pause mode, because the rate of affordable housing is well under 1% in this community. And, you know, from our standpoint, we're just hijacking the future of these kids who cannot get into stable housing you know, to Jim's point earlier about kids starting the school year in one school district and not being able to finish, we know that kids who experience any level of homelessness are 3 times more likely to drop out of school, 5 times more likely to commit a violent crime, and the really heartbreaking one, 7 times more likely to attempt suicide. And so I'll share just a very quick story. I talked to a single mom we served 3 years ago, and she told me when they went through the Family Promise program, eventually got into permanent housing, the whole mindset of her family and her kids changed. They settled into school, their peer group became stable. They got involved in music and drama and sports. She has a daughter who's now in her mid-20s, who's a medical assistant at Providence. And this mom, Bridget, told me, never would have happened had we continued to drift and just into this, you know, uncertain sea of unpredictable housing. So we really appreciate the discussion. We need to do something. These families are drowning and we need to find out a solution. And this is a great start.
Thank you very much.
I can piggyback off of what Craig was saying too. One of my tenants, he was sleeping in his car, him and his 6-year-old daughter, when we first worked with Catholic Charities to get them placed into one of my tenants. And this was one of my first ones as a landlord. And early on, we established communication. And I told, we talked, and I said, listen, man, we're taking a chance here. We're new landlords. You can't be late on your rent. Got to take care of the place. Well, guess what happened in month 2? He was late. When month 3, he was late. We had conversations. You know, it was like, hey, man, I'm not going to charge you the $35. Get it together. You got to get your finance together and communicate with me. And I can show it. We work together. And he just renewed his lease. He's been on time 12 straight months. He's advanced in the job. Not only does he have his daughter now, but now his son came from Arizona to stay with him as well. So now he has 2 kids in the place and has the stability, and even got to the point, Chauncey, I got a new washer. Can we take yours out and put mine in now? Those are the things we love to see, and that type of growth from a man. He wouldn't have qualified normally. He didn't qualify. He didn't pass the test for his credit, and he told me he had an eviction from Arizona. But the fact of the matter that he was able to do that and just re-sign the lease. And matter of fact, like, do you have a property with a 3-bedroom? I'm ready to move up. You know what I mean? Those are the type of stories that we talk about, because again, we know all the obstacles and the barriers in the way, but we also know that we can work together. And like Jim was saying, it's going to be small incremental steps, but we can do it. We can work together and find ways where we can make some changes while at the same time knocking on the door saying, hey, the city needs to do something, the state needs to do something. But in the meantime, look at the work that we're putting in. You see what I'm saying? So that's what it comes down to, these action plans. Like Marilyn said, I'm all about the action. Let's see the action. Let's make action happen. And we can show, and it can grow. The community can grow. Our city can grow. And imagine us being the example when someone gets on another Zoom call within their city and say, hey, this is what they did in Spokane.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Thank you so much. Anybody else? Questions, comments? We've got about 19 minutes left. It was going to go till noon, so it's open for any of that.
Marilyn, if I could have a comment.
Absolutely.
We've had in the last 10 months an opportunity to really learn a lot. We've basically had a just cause ordinance that has really identified the issues surrounding challenged tenants. And also we're having a unique opportunity to really identify landlords who are not fulfilling their responsibilities. We've seen landlords and tenants communicate and have a dialogue, which is unique because of those circumstances. We've seen a recognition by government of the funding assistance that's necessary to deal with poverty. There have been dialogues going on between all the parties that has raised the consciousness on both sides, the challenges that tenants face, Landlords, I have constant comments from them about, my God, I really didn't understand the significance of poverty and how it extends beyond just my tenancy role with individuals. I've also seen a lack of definition from the public sector on the role that the private sector is going to play in low-income housing. There are different policies coming out of the city, the county, the state, and the feds. Even the timing of a lot of the issues that are a part of the pandemic, the communication has been poor. But there is so much data that's being collected that has to do with the issues of poverty that we can learn from. And the policy issues of that are very concerning are the issue of, is it morally right to profit off poverty in low-income housing? And again, is public housing the primary role of the public sector? And so if we can come out of this COVID situation, one positive thing is data. And I remember when that Youngtown group came to Spokane early this year and talked about how they overcame the challenges that they had due to economic issues on housing. They emphasized data, that decisions have to be made on data. And the city at that time had collected about a third of the data that this group had recognized as a part of their success process. The second thing was timing. And Jim Frank made the comment that these things don't happen overnight. And what Youngstown has done is a 20-year plan, and having the patience to guide us through that particular period. These public policy issues, I think, are just critical. And because of COVID, I think we're going to have a database that's going to help public officials make more responsible decisions. That's just my comments.
Well, thank you, Steve. And I think that's very, very important to underscore, because as devastating as COVID has been, I sense that there are some real great opportunities here to take what we know now, what we see very clearly, expand on that data. And that's one of the reasons I'm really so pleased that this just kind of came together like it did, this opportunity, because one thing I've come to realize is there's lots of different little groups and silos, and we need to come out of those, and we need to have transparent, open public discussion, and then plans of action. And like, I'm just thinking, okay, what's the low-hanging fruit here? And Jim talked about lot size transitions and just making a change in the cities, focusing on the city of Spokane now, make a change in that based on density and building mass. So if that's something we can leave here with as a, as something to move forward on and do as an actionable item, great. Maybe it's the landlord registry, since there was 3 years of data collected in recent past, and maybe that's what can be done. And like you said, Steve, this isn't a revenue source for the city. It's the purpose is to be able to identify quickly who the either the rental management company is and or the owner of a given property. And so what are people thinking would be some of those incremental changes that need to be or can be addressed first and foremost, and then move forward?
That might you. Anybody else have any questions or comments? I have one from Alex Franz, WCCDA. Has there ever been a successful common campaign of sorts across neighborhood councils? Let me read, sorry. Unfortunately, the virtual meetings have been a huge obstacle in getting resident participation. Nevertheless, I've received multiple times the survey link to the city's housing action plan, but I work for a community center. how are they reaching everyone with that? How can we engage everyone in a safe and open way? Let's see. So where and how can these connections be made while everyone else is being worked on as far as legislation and zoning? That's kind of a summary of what he was asking about. Anybody respond to that? I think that goes back to, it's hard to interact with the neighborhood councils because of Zoom, but what are other methods that we could use? I think is what he's asking. Is there other ideas on how we can get that involvement?
I've read what Alex asked in the chat.
Thank you.
I think this is complicated. I'm going to say something probably a little controversial here, but I think it's a mistake to think that the neighborhood councils truly represent the neighborhoods. So that's the first issue that we have, is that the structure that we've set up of these neighborhood councils, the people that are on neighborhood councils are basically people that have the time to work on this kind of stuff, which means they're basically wealthy and white. And so you don't get the representation of people. You don't get a good cross-section of people in neighborhoods represented on neighborhood councils. Now, that's not always true, but it happens often, and I've seen it in neighborhoods like West Central, for example. It's better now than it used to be, but neighborhood councils get taken over by people that have special interests of one kind or another. And so that's a challenge, that you have to educate more than the neighborhood councils. You have to educate everyone that lives in those neighborhoods. And I think the other challenge is that there's a lot of work has been done on a lot of different subject areas. For example, Brian Begg set up a sustainability committee that did a lot of work on ADUs, as accessory dwelling units. They did a lot of work. They drafted an ordinance, and then it stops. It ends, and there was no implementation. All the effort went into it, and then there was no implementation done, no follow-up by the city. At the end of the day, the city has to be committed to this. The city and its staff have to have a passion for solving this problem. And so that's an issue. And this housing study, and Alex is referring to the survey that's been sent out for the housing action plan. And the trouble is, it's more studying of stuff that we already know. And it's making people think that if we study stuff enough, it's going to actually lead to some actionable result, when it's actually not. All we're doing is wasting 18 months of energy on doing another plan, instead of using that 18 months to actually make some incremental changes, actually do something. And so it's hard, because the people that need the help the most are not the people that fill out surveys, and they're not the people that sit on neighborhood councils.
Very good. Oh, go ahead, Marilyn.
Well, I just was going to say, so that kind of goes back to what the question I just put out there. What's the low-hanging fruit? What one or two actionable items would be fairly simple? We don't have to do studies. We don't have to have long, drawn-out conversations and add to the pile to dust. What can be done? Is that the lot size transitions with density and building mass focus, or the landlord registry? Other thoughts or ideas? I mean, there are some great community groups that have the bandwidth to be able to pull together and you know, getting people informed and rallied, like what happened with 1590 and Spokane Alliance and what they did with that action. And here, you know, the history was that the city council members had actually wanted this. And then when it came time for the vote, there had to be some, you know, some amendment made in order to get the votes, but thank gosh it passed. And this is a mechanism that should be being used by every municipality and taxing authority, like, you know, Spokane County. I mean, this should be used because the need is there, and it's huge. So what can we do moving forward?
Ooh, so again, I can take this for an example. Look at how this meeting came together, Marilyn. What was it, 10 days ago, I met with Hart after attending 2 meetings and said, let me tell you what my plan is. Well, not only have I met with Hart, Alex, who asked that very question, Alex and I went around, and this is strictly in the West Central area, right? And I live in East, I live in the Chief Gary neighborhood. Let me just be clear on that, but fully committed to this model and what works in West Central. 1, they got the TIF money. 2, Jim Frank has been a big advocate behind it. So we have all those things. So it's just a matter of putting it together. That's something we can do. We've already said we're going to do action plans, right? Here's one. We're going to have another meeting with that. Alex is connected with Western. She works at the community center. So she's right there, because what Jim said, this happens a lot of times. A lot of rich people get together in the room and tell poor folk what they need to do and what plans they're going to have. And that has been the history of our country. So it's a matter of connecting with the people who this matters to. Alex is there day to day talking to these people who this affects. So when I have a meeting with Alex, whether we do it social distance or face-to-face, finding a way, and then I have a meeting with Hart, and then I listen to the impact. That's one way to do it, because somebody in that room knows how, somebody on the city council, right? That when one of the meetings I went to, the impact was telling the city council member what was all in the TIF. You know what I mean? So that they're giving her the information, saying, no. Affordable housing kicks in right away. And then in 2032 is when it has to be 50% of it. Those were things that they were passing that knowledge along, back to Jim's point. So when we start doing this and then have the action items, because that's the thing too. I love data. Data's great, but we've known data. Redlining was there a long time ago. We knew that, and things are still there. Nothing's been done. So yes, you need the data for them to move, but when we have those things, and look what the Hart and the Spokane Alliance was able to do with 1590. When they got people together and presented it and went full force for it, we can do the same thing with affordable housing.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Julie Garcia, you've had your hand up a while.
I just wanted to reiterate what Jim said, was that neighborhood councils don't necessarily represent the folks that we're trying to reach, the neighborhoods. We have witnessed this firsthand in the pop-up warming center at the city church on Garland. There has to be more outreach to the community and a whole as that neighborhood, because most of the folks do not attend those meetings nor know that those meetings are happening. And the folks in the neighborhood council have proven that agendas come before their constituents, I guess. So we have to focus on reaching out to folks farther than just neighborhood councils.
Yeah. Totally agree. Totally agree. Becky, did you still have a question or comment?
No, Marilyn pretty much covered what I was saying, because I mean, as with 1590, we had a specific cause. We drowned the council with our comments. We stood up, and I'm hoping that we can do the same thing, because in my mind, from listening to the people who know, zoning is a big clog in the pipeline. I mean, I've attended seminars where we talk about public transportation. Public transportation has to be available for low-income housing. And so then I heard Ben talk about parking, and I'm thinking, well, if we have housing on a transit line, we don't necessarily need parking. So I guess my question to the people in the know is, what is the first thing we can do that would make things better? So can we talk to council about lot size? Can we talk to council about allowing housing in business above businesses, which is, I guess, the problem on Sprague? What's the first thing we could go to council and start hammering the doors about? Or even the county, I guess. We've got to remember that we need to be focusing on the county as much as the city. We tend to forget that, but we need to spread our voice and do more yelling.
Yes, we do. Yes, I live out in the valley and I totally agree with that. Yeah, we need to get more people out here.
Becky, just to follow up on your comment and to give perhaps a gentle marching order to a few folks, and I think, Jim, you know this intimately, is that these zoning decisions and these recommendations that come forward, for example, that suite of ADU recommendations that were presented to City Council a few weeks ago, and got a rather lukewarm reception at City Council, those changes now proceed to our City Planning Commission. And that City Planning Commission is the group of subject matter experts, quote unquote, that will review, kind of analyze the items that are being presented forward, and then work on making a recommendation from the Planning Commission back to City Council, whether the Planning Commission recommends making those changes or not. Almost all of these development regulations that are on the table, whether it's zoning changes, lot sizes, all those things need to go through the Planning Commission process. So if there's an area for this group to bone up on your knowledge and your expertise, I'd start looking to the Planning Commission effort, what that process looks like, what that policy looks like. Join one of their meetings. They're all on Zoom, so you can join them. The biggest obstacle and the biggest difference, Becky, from this and 1590 or others is that this is a slow burn. These changes are slow. It involves a lot of meetings, a lot of time. There's very little purview for council or the mayor to act by fiat. They can't just wake up on Tuesday morning and decide they have 7 votes on something and do it. They generally have to go through this planning commission and evaluation process. Where there's enough will, things can move faster, but where there's, I would say, a lukewarm reception, which is, I would say, where a number of these changes are, they may seem like low-hanging fruit to us, but they have advocates and opponents on all sides. They can get slowed down in that planning commission process and the city council process. And so where we can advocate for things to be included, the first great example is this ADU package that's going forward. The simple ask of the city council is to put that on the planning commission's work plan for 2021. Because the city council tells the planning commission what to work on and what not to work on. And so for the city council to hear that ADU reform is critical, that zoning issues that are raised are critical. Those are the sorts of things that need to be on the Planning Commission's work plan. And a challenge that I've kind of raised to a number of our city council members is that the Planning Commission should solely focus on housing issues in 2021. Absent critical, like kind of one-off scenarios, that their priority focus should be on housing and housing access issues in 2021. I'm not sure we're going to get there, but that's been my ask of the city council.
Thank you so much. It is 12 o'clock. So if you need to leave, if you have any other questions, please throw them in the chat. We are going to save this recording as well as the chat, and hopefully be able to get it out, if not before, after New Year's Day. So please feel free to leave if you need to. If not, and you'd like to continue a little longer, that is great. I think 12:30 is our limit, because I have other things going on. So I don't know, Marilyn, how you feel about that.
I'd just like to finish by saying thank you so much to our guest panelists, and really appreciate you being here, and all the other folks who are involved in one manner or another with addressing some of the very basic human needs in our community, and those who are part of planning processes. This is what we need to be doing. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to come and participate in this. And I know it was last minute, but I'm hoping this isn't the last this isn't a be all and end all. We need to have more of this. So we'll keep those connections. We've got, ways of getting in touch with you, and we'll see what we can do moving forward. So thank you all. And
one last note, a big, huge thank you to Barry for allowing us to utilize his Zoom meeting access for this. It was last minute, but he was very generous, and we really thank him for allowing us to have that opportunity.
Yep. All right. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
All right. Don't shut it off yet. Barry's going to help us save it. I'm not sure how to do that. Okay. He's the one that saved it, or he started the recording. So I think he has to be the one to figure out how to do all that. So.
Okay.
Oh, goodness. My dog just fell off of my bar stool.
Oh, Barry, I think you're muted still.
I said your dog shouldn't be drinking anyway. So Peter, I think did you record it?
Yeah, I think I'm looking at it right now on my desktop here. So it looks like it's a little bit under 2 gigs. I could send it. I think I can send that by WeTransfer. I don't know who wants the files emailed to them.
Probably Sherri.
Sherri?
I'm thinking, okay. Right?
Sherri, do I already have your email address from the invite?
You're muted, Sherri.
It's sv.communityadvocates@gmail.com.
Okay.
And I should just be able to download it and it'll save on my desktop.
Yep.
Okay, cool. And is the chat included in that?
I'm not sure. I believe so.
Okay. Okay, cool.
And I'm